Hello everyone, welcome back once again to our second video for this week. And again, just to be clear, I am actually publishing these videos for the appropriate week finally. So this should be for everything that you're viewing or the lessons that we're covering between November the 9th and November the 13th, if my math and or calendar understanding is correct, which is not usually, so feel free to double check me. But anyway, as I mentioned last time in the video you watched, we were going to talk about then the fragmentation or the splitting up of the Islamic world. This time, we're going to talk about how Europe began to form a more distinct identity for this during this time period, and arguably became more united in some ways. So again, one thing we're going to be doing a lot throughout the rest of the semester is really comparing the Islamic and Christian worlds, because they were really the two dominant influences at this time. In the meantime, we'll of course start off looking at key terms. We're going to look at manorialism a bit, which is a sort of an economic or political system. We'll look at the infamous Pope Urban II. We'll talk about the First Crusade. We'll talk about the Children's Crusade. And we're going to end talking about the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. Again, as always, I just want to very quickly remind you about your upcoming assignments. I already mentioned all these in my last video, so I won't spend a ton of time on them. But of course, you are going to have your 4th content quiz coming up soon. You have your 2nd writing assignment, and you have your 5th content quiz, all coming up within the next couple of weeks. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know. But in the meantime, few questions again I'd like you to consider really going over the rest of the semester, but especially this lesson. Like I said, we're talking about the formation of identity or national identity today. Very complex topic, and we'll also introduce the topic of nationalism a little bit. Very important topics, obviously, so I'd like you to sort of consider these. First, why is it maybe important for a country to have a strong sense of identity? Why might it be important, for example, for America to have a strong sense of some sort of national identity? And if so, do we have a strong sense of an American identity right now? What does it actually even mean to be an American? I know, very fun questions for me to be asking at 10 in the morning, but what are you going to do? In the meantime, also, how should a country identify itself in comparison to outsiders? One thing we're going to talk about really, especially in this lesson, but for the rest of the semester, is how oftentimes a country will form its identity and its sense of who or what it actually is, basically in opposition or in competition with something else. Should that be the case? And should we refer to outsiders as barbarians like the Greeks, Romans, and Chinese often did? Finally, also consider what nationalism is, and be prepared to discuss its potential differences with patriotism and whether or not these are good things. But in the meantime, what I'd like you to do to get a better understanding of manorialism and what life was like in most of Western Europe at this point, I'd like you to watch a YouTube video, which is once again from the great movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Now, this of course is again an exaggerated comedic view of this time period, but it still is based in some historical fact. So based on this video, try to reach some conclusions about what life would have been like for the average European, if that's what they were, during the Middle Ages. So again, I'm going to assume you're going to go ahead and pause this video now and pull that one up. Alright, very good. I'm going to again assume that you did that. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and talk about the formation of a European identity. One of the things that separated Europe apart from the Muslim world or the other spheres of influence that we've talked about, as I mentioned a bit last week, is that their political power was mostly very localized. For the most part, a lot of Western Europe was set up in a manorialism system, sometimes also known as feudalism by some historians back in the day especially. This is essentially an economic system like the one depicted in this video, where local lords, mostly that knightly elite class we talked about a little bit earlier, would live in some sort of castle and own the land surrounding it, where that land would be farmed by peasants. It would also occasionally be used for manufacturing, but again, since Europe wasn't extremely united, they weren't typically able to put together much manufacturing. So again, is this a very united system? I'll get a pretty short pause on that one because I kind of gave that one away. Obviously, it typically isn't. Most of these peasants are just going to stay on this land their entire lives, And as you saw in this video, for example, they a lot of times weren't very familiar with the outside world. Again, like I said, it's a very exaggerated comedy, but it wouldn't be uncommon for many peasants like this to not even know if there was some sort of king who was supposed to be ruling over them. They would only really be familiar with their local lord. So, this also raises the question of whether or not these people are European. If so, what makes them European? Because it's not really a strong national identity at this point. None of these people are really going to identify as I'm a German, I'm a Frenchman, I'm a British, I'm English, I'm Spanish. None of those identities were much of a major factor yet. So what makes them European? We talked about it a little bit last week and before, a little bit before that. Very good again, audience watching at home. Religion is, of course, going to play a major factor. And so, for historians who would consider these people to still be European, it would be based on their allegiance to the Roman Catholic Church or some larger form of Christianity. And if you'll remember, after the Western Roman Empire fell, it was really all that united people across Europe since there was no large political system anymore. But anyway, manorialism did spread across Europe and lead to a few different factors. For example, between about 1100 and 1200 CE, about 200,000 peasants went all the way from Western Europe into, which we would consider to be places like Holland, Belgium, and France, into the frontier of Europe, which would be Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and the Baltic states, in order to gain more freedom from their old feudal lords. Now, why do we think we consider this part of Europe to be the frontier? And will we still consider these migrants to be European then, if they've left the heartland of Europe, as you might call it? For example, I bet most of you, and I don't mean this as an insult by the way, but probably couldn't name me any of the Baltic states. Alright, as some of you may be aware, especially American history, and many more American history students, a lot of times we typically identify America as being more of a descendant of Western Europe, because that's where most of our initial immigrants came from who we credit with the founding of this nation. So typically, especially from an American perspective, we like to focus on these Western European countries. So it does often lead us to sort of neglect these other countries. But again, it does raise the question of whether or not these Eastern Europeans are still European, at least at this point. Since we mentioned before that the Roman Catholic Church is one of the main things that unites them, Russia in particular does raise a question about how exactly someone becomes European. Now, to quickly summarize what Russia was going through, Russia, as some of you may know, was located between Central Asian kingdoms and Western Europe. If you remember India, this would be extremely beneficial for Russia because, as we talked about a little bit, that's where all the trade and everything is going through. So essentially, Russia is going to be making quite a bit of money setting up these trading centers. At this point, Russia wasn't very united either, like much of the rest of Europe. Essentially, you would have these trading posts set up, which would essentially just be cities to give an outpost for people to migrate and trade through, which would be surrounded by much larger forests, and they would be very widely scattered. However, they were quite wealthy and could get very impressive. For example, you had the city of Kiev, which was modeled after Constantinople, and as you can see here, contained a miniature Hagia Sophia, which was the great church of Constantinople. As you might guess, since Russia was modeling itself after Constantinople, they also practiced Greek Orthodoxy for the most part instead of Roman Catholicism. So, based on that, is Russia and a lot of these Eastern European areas, are they a part of Europe? I'll figure out what to do during these awkward pauses eventually. But yeah, I really can't give a definitive answer for this, of course, but it does again raise very interesting questions. If religious identity is what unites people as Europeans, if people are following Greek Orthodoxy instead, are they still Europeans? Are they still Roman, for example, like we talked about? Very interesting questions, which is why I love to discuss identity and identity formation so much. It's very complicated, but it really makes you think. But in the meantime, to get a little bit more into how Catholicism and European identity was formed, 12 Christianity was, of course, still a major factor, and as Christianity started to spread, it created even more of a unified identity, and also increase the church's power. For example, since Europe was not very united, but it was being settled by more feudalist and trading communities. This meant that even though there wasn't a real clear political organization all the time, churches could now go and be supported beyond traditional monastery centers because there would at least be some kind of local lord in order to support them. This, of course, increases the reach and influence of Christianity because they're literally starting to spread across the world now. For example, marriage and divorce around this time after 1200 started to become officially officiated by the church. So your marriage and your divorce was no longer a private matter and had to go through the church. Now, is this a good thing? This, of course, is again a very complicated question, so I won't get into it too much. But for some people would like the idea that the church is now over marriage and divorce because many people believe this is rightly under the purview of God anyway. The other side you're going to hear is, of course, the people who don't like the idea that marriage and divorce is now so restricted, which many women especially might blame for a woman's traditional inability to get a divorce or to have a say in marriage for a very long time. So again, really depends upon your perspective for that one. Francis of Assisi, from 1182 to 1226, also helped to spread a more Christian identity. He started to encourage the idea that Christians should all feel remorse for their sins, confess these sins to local priests, and continually strive to be better Christians. So now essentially everyone's starting to get a more universal message, which is helping Christians to behave in similar ways and identify with each other more easily. Publications also started to come out more frequently to support Christian ideas. For example, in 1264, you saw the publication of the Summa contra Gentiles, or the Summary of Christian Belief Against Non-Christians, published by Thomas Aquinas. That's probably more accurate. Now, this document was meant to demonstrate the rationality of Christianity. Is that important? Again, yes, you could argue this is very important in showing that Christianity is becoming a more distinct and separate religion and is again starting to identify itself in comparison to other religions. So essentially the whole point of this book is to prove the superiority of Christianity over other religions such as potentially Islam, Buddhism, and all sorts of other things. This again suggests that Christianity is becoming a more distinct and single identity, which you could argue is potentially less tolerant because Christianity is starting to oppose itself to other religions. This development helped potentially lead to things such as the Crusades, which I'm sure many of you is what you're probably looking forward to me getting to as soon as I went over the key terms. Many historians claim that European identity was mainly solidified in opposition to the Muslim world. Now, this is something we talked about a few times. Why is a constant threat like a Muslim empire, for example, in this case, potentially so useful in helping to form a united identity? Excuse the frequent sips of water. I've talked a lot in these recordings over the past few days. But yes, this is again something we've talked about a few times in this class. Having a constant threat can be very useful into forming your identity because it essentially gives a threat for everyone to be united against. Many of these memorialists might not have been really concerned with uniting amongst each other if there was no threat, but if you have a constant threat like a Muslim empire to whip people up against, it encourages much more unity. So essentially, these people are going to have a way to identify themselves in opposition to the Muslim empire. So whereas, for example, these Russians might not have gotten along with individuals in Holland, Belgium, or France, now potentially they can say, oh, well, at least we're not Muslim. We need to unite to fight against the Muslim world. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions. But obviously it didn't always work out that way, and there were still divisions among Christian Europe, but we'll get to that a little bit more over the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, the Crusades did, of course, begin around this time in the turn of the millennium and led to many consequences. Essentially, the Crusades are credited with having started in 1095 when Pope Urban II urged the warrior class in Paris to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. So instead of just fighting amongst themselves, he wanted them to go reclaim the Holy Land. He claimed that this violence would be an absolution from sin and would not be a source of sin itself. So essentially, if you go over and fight this holy war, you're not sinning, you're actually going to be forgiven for all of your sins. Now, why is that such an important claim? Yeah, this one's pretty straightforward, so don't worry, audience at home, I'm going to give you a very long pause on this one. But obviously, this is essentially what's going to get people motivated to participate in the Crusades and shows the power of the church's influence in people's lives. People were so convinced that the Roman Catholic Church had ultimate religious authority in Europe and were so caught up in that identity that many people were willing to go and engage in something as risky as the Crusades on the church's behalf. So again, despite all the divisions that existed in Europe, it was still possible at this time for many different individuals to unite under the banner of the church. This led to the First Crusade by 1097, when 60,000 soldiers from northwestern Europe marched to seize Jerusalem. There were many different types of troops. You would have your heavily armored elite knights once again, along with impoverished peasants who were seeking salvation or riches from Muslim territories. They were also supported by fleets from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa in Italy. Now, one other incident I'd like to focus on that doesn't get as much attention typically is the infamous 1212 Children's Crusade. This historical account is actually so insane that many people think it's at least an exaggeration. But according to the official historical record we have from the time period, it is claimed that 12-year-old Stephen of Blois led a following of children to Paris to seek the King of France's permission in order to start his own crusade. This is actually believed to be the inspiration for the Pied Piper legend by some, because you have someone leading a huge group of children across a vast distance. However, the king refused to support him. Despite this, they continued their crusade anyway. It is believed that they went unarmed because they believed that they could convert Muslims through divine intervention and wouldn't need to use force. This might help explain why the crusade ended so poorly, of course. The crusade is actually believed to have broken apart after they reached Italy and were once again denied sanction for their crusade, this time by the Pope. This also helps to explain maybe why this children's crusade was labeled as fanatics. So on the one hand, a crusade is fine in the eyes of the church when you're getting official religious sanction. However, this was not only to a group of children, which is going to seem outlandish to everyone anyway, but they're going ahead even though they don't have the sanction of any Christian political leader or any Christian religious leader. So again, this is essentially about having church control and increasing church and political influence. Not just about letting anybody and their grandmother, or I guess in this case their granddaughter, hopefully someone appreciates that pun, but anyway, go on their own crusade. That's not really the point. Now, to give you a very brief outline of what the Crusades were like in some instances, they were, of course, very violent for a very large group of people. For example, in 1096, it was recorded that a Count Amicio led a massacre of Jews across the Rhineland in modern-day Germany. In 1099, the First Crusade was actually successful in sacking Jerusalem, although, as we'll talk about in a second, no permanent Christian kingdom was ever set up in Jerusalem. And they killed hundreds of men, women, and children as they entered the city. By 1204, Frankish crusaders, as I mentioned a little bit last week, had declared war against Constantinople and had looted and burned much of their city, including some of their greatest churches and the imperial library. So again, very violent actions that is very questionable at the very least if they can be justified. But in the meantime, I do want to look at the overall failure of the Crusades, because as I mentioned, despite the frequent Crusades, there being 9 actually if you count the unsanctioned Children's Crusade, no permanent real kingdoms were ever set up in Arabic territory. A couple of reasons for this. Most knights would just return home after their campaigns. They essentially would view it as just a religious pilgrimage, which of course pilgrimages were very common during this period, as I've already mentioned a little bit, and had no real intention of setting up a permanent kingdom or permanent residence far away from their homes. One of the more serious problems was that even though they did occasionally set up a network of castles, they were far away from areas such as Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. Why would that matter so much? Very good. Once again, audience listening at home. As we've talked about a little bit, Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad are some of the seats of major Islamic powers during this time period. So even when these Christian groups had claimed some territory for the Catholic Church or their monarchs, and were able to establish some castles, it was nowhere near Muslim centers of power. So they were no real threat to any Arabic organization. And also, as we'll talk even more about next week, there was a lack of prolonged unity in the Christian world. Many of these Christian groups and Christian countries and areas were not really able to cooperate for a very long period of time. As you might guess, one of the major reasons is, again, this divide that still exists between Greek Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. So many Catholics and Greek Orthodox groups would never really unite together to fight the Muslims. But there were also other reasons that we'll go over a bit next week. But in the meantime, I do want to look at one of the more major successful efforts of Christians during this time period, the Reconquista. The Reconquista was essentially the Reconquest, which was a campaign, or known as the Reconquest, was a campaign led by Spanish Christian kings to expel all Muslim kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula. So essentially from modern-day Spain and Portugal. Now, one thing that historians have pointed out that I do particularly think is interesting is that this campaign technically shouldn't be called the Reconquista. I know we only talked about it very briefly, but if you were paying attention, Muslim empires and kingdoms in Spain had been set up many centuries before and had actually arrived before Christianity got to Spain. So essentially this should be called the Conquest, because Christianity is essentially conquering these areas for the first time. Why then do you think they call it the Reconquest, or the Reconquista if you're Spanish? Alright, very good. Once again, the more shrewd among you. This is essentially a propaganda tactic, many historians argue. Your campaign seems much more justified if you claim that you're reconquering lands that belong to Spain and belong to the church, instead of just saying, hey, we're going to go in and take these lands away from people for no real reason. Much easier to justify. And unlike the Crusades, the Reconquista did have long-term success. By 1061, they were able to capture Toledo and most of northern Spain, and by 1246, they conquered Seville and captured most of the southern continent, or peninsula. These conquests were successful enough to add about 100,000 square miles of territory for Christian Europe. To make matters worse for Muslims in Europe, by 1265, the French and conquered Muslim-held Sicily at the urging of the Pope. So essentially, while they're not able to increase their identity by spreading into Arabic territory, now Europe is more united under Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church, leading to a more increased and strengthened European identity within the modern-day continent. So again, that's essentially all I have for you today. Just again, let me know if you have any questions about these assignments or anything else we've covered, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.